But what I'm arguing is that the structures in which elected politicians work effectively force them to misrepresent us to some degree. Politicians can lie when they choose to, and often enough they will, yes. But they're also economical with the truth because sometimes they just have to be. As the French philosopher Bruno Latour wrote, if faithful representation is the political holy grail, politics will always be disappointing, based on unrealistic assumptions about immediacy and authenticity. Latour claims that we expect too much of political representation if we expect it to provide a form of fidelity, exactitude, or truth that is totally impossible. Now, political leaders know that their claims to be representative are ambivalent. That's why they bolster their positions by constructing varied representations of themselves, portrayals and depictions. They know their representative claims will always be partial, unstable, and ripe for exposure. Alexander the Great understood this well, keeping close control of his image on coins, for example. Political leaders regularly portray themselves as standing for the nation, above and beyond narrow and partial interests, wrapping themselves in flags, for example. The architecture of their contexts, again, also contributes to this need and to this habit. And all of this is part of representation seen through the lens of the representative claim. And to argue in this way is also to stress the performative side of representation. Politicians are actors. They are often really bad actors. That's true, but they are actors nevertheless. And many politicians have recognised that performance involved in what they do. The long-term post-war Australian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, believed that the core task of political leadership was that of the political artist. One of his successors in Australia, Paul Keating, believed that political leadership involves a public performance, and he talked about being out there on stage doing the Placido Domingo. In fact, I think one of his biographies was called Doing the Placido Domingo. Keating used a movie director as his public speaking coach. The Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, has reportedly been taking lessons from the director of the Gaiety School of Acting in Dublin to help him on the political stage. As Irving Goffman, the American sociologist, wrote, all the world is not, of course, a stage, but the crucial ways in which it isn't are not easy to specify. And as Richard Fenno, a scholar of the US Congress, wrote, Goffman does not talk about politicians, but politicians know what Goffman is talking about. So there are ambivalences around elective representation. So how do the claims of the unelected fit into all this? Now basically all the factors I've just mentioned open up gaps which can be exploited by the unelected. The partial, artificial nature of any representation opens up space for new unconventional claims to try to fill the gaps. So non-elected actors claim to be representatives. Why do we sometimes listen to their claims? Again, in rather stark and general terms, unelected actors don't have to pretend to represent the whole person's interests or wants. They can explicitly be partial. They can stand for a continuous, evolving sense of us, not a frozen snapshot. They're not spatially challenged by the borders of nations, but can claim to speak for interests that span different countries. The sound of the phone wasn't part of the script. But I quite like it. It'd be good, wouldn't it? It could be a Noel Edmonds moment. Yeah. It's the Pro-Vice-Chancellor on the phone. Yeah. So unelected actors also have to invoke and enthuse an audience for their claims, which may not be there beforehand. They don't have a captive audience. They have to work harder even to define who their audience might be. So we choose elected representatives, but we are also fated to have them. We're stuck with them. We do not choose non-elected representatives in such a clear way, but at the same time we are not so fated to have them or to follow them. In short, non-elective representation can potentially give us some of what elective representation cannot. But who are these potential unelected representatives? Let's look at some possible examples. I don't claim these examples are all legitimate representatives, I want to make that clear, but they're kind of raw material cases for thinking through the question. So I come to how we might think about evaluating claims in a moment. So the kind of claims and examples I'm going to look at very briefly are grouped into three groups. Firstly, what I call deeper roots representative claims. Secondly, expertise and special credentials claims. And thirdly, wider interests and new voices claims. So first of all, to the deeper roots ones. So an individual or group might claim to represent the true interests of people because they speak for higher principles, such as religious requirements. Iran's Guardian Council might be one example. The UK House of Lords is an example of a non-elective representative claim, and the claim is based on context or embeddedness. The Lords is not itself elected, but it's a traditional part of a broader system which is democratic. And similarly, a claim to represent the true interests of the people might arise from tradition, such as the authority amongst Tibetans of the Dalai Lama. Monarchs in general make similar sorts of claims. Secondly, expertise and special credentials claims. Now, specialist expertise comes from professional training, not from election. The group, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which takes positions on relevant political issues in the US, might be an example of a representative claim arising from specialist expertise. A non-elective claim may also arise from a need to address corruption in a system.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
As the voice of a true American patriot for the 4th of July. Now, Martin Luther King, for example, claimed to represent groups excluded from American democracy, and also, as you heard, in a sense, for the true ethos of that system against its current corrupted shape. A claim might also be based on the need to address serious policy failure. For example, recent UK governments have been very fond of appointing czars. I don't know how they originally came to be czars. And the czars are designed or put in place to consider radical new policy options, in the old cliche, to think the unthinkable. So in the past 3 years alone, I've been on a czar hunt. I've probably missed a few, but in the last 3 years alone, there has, at least in the UK, been a drugs czar, a privacy czar, a cycling czar. I might have misread that. It might be a czar who cycles, but a rough sleepers czar and a mental health czar. The irony often has been that the czars have found themselves fairly powerless, outmaneuvered by much more seasoned politicians and officials. Now, the third category of representative claims, third category of examples. So someone might claim to represent larger vital human interests and needs that lack a voice. So you can consider here, for example, the rock stars Geldof and Bono and their advocacy of third world debt relief and famine relief and poverty alleviation. A representative claim may also be based on the fact that an important perspective is not even being heard or even voiced. There may, for instance, be a surrogate spokesperson for a group whose interests are not spoken for in the elected legislature. We could cite Australian and British parliamentarians who take on roles as surrogate representatives of young people, gays and lesbians, and minority ethnic groups. We could also think of so-called voteless constituencies, such as children, in a similar kind of vein. Then there's also what we can call the word from the street. So a claim might be based on massive and tangible demonstration of popular support.